Just getting the live streaming started here, and then we'll get going. Okay, I think we're live. Thank y'all very much for joining today. I'm Elizabeth Russi-Roque. I'm the current chair of the LD4 Steering Group, and I'm pleased to be facilitating the session today on our very first day of LD4 2022. All of you have probably reviewed the conference schedule, maybe even attended one of the first two workshops. We've already had activities going on this morning, but you may be wondering about what else LD4, the LD4 community, has been up to this year. So today's panel with LD4 Steering will give you a chance to meet other members of the LD4 Steering Group. We are a group that supports affinity groups, the conferences, the community in general, and other activities that we have going on within the LD4 community umbrella. We're going to give an update on the accomplishments of the LD4 community over the past year. We'll talk about some future directions that we're pursuing, and most importantly, we'll provide a chance to hear from all of you and hear what you're interested in working with the community, or where you think we need to have a new initiative or do things differently. The Q&A as well as the chat is open throughout the session today, and I'll be watching that along with my fellow panelists. Feel free to add your comments and questions as we go along, and then we'll address those during the open Q&A at the conclusion of the session. Just a word that today's session is being recorded and being live streamed, so just be aware that that is there, but it also gives you a chance to revisit it at the end. Claire, if you could pop it on to the next slide, that would be great. So I want to start with doing a few introductions of the LD4 Steering Group. I'd like to ask everybody to introduce themselves. For those on the panel, if you could give your name, your institution, the usual things, and maybe a couple words about what you find most exciting about being part of LD4. Claire, you're first on my screen. Why don't you go ahead and get us going?
Great, and just thank you, Elizabeth, for kicking us off, and welcome to everyone who's attending. My name is Claire Demarco. I'm the Director of Information Discovery Services at Harvard, and I've been part of the LD4 community for a couple of years now in varying roles, but I'm very excited to have this as the second benchmark conference as part of the steering group. This is my second conference with this group of folks. And something that makes me really excited, and that we'll talk about in the presentation today, is just the organic growth of this community over the past year, and how we're really charting our own course in terms of the activities, the practices that we engage in together, the way that we share information. It really does feel like it's grown from the folks who are here. And I'm excited to see that continue to reflect as we invite new members into the community and expand our reach. I will pass it over to Tom.
Hi, thanks, Claire. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Tom Kramer. I'm the Associate University Librarian and the Director of Digital Library Systems and Services at Stanford University. I have been involved in LD4 since the very first project with Cornell in Iowa, which was about 9 years ago. And I'm currently a co-PI on the grants from the Mellon Foundation. One of the things that makes me most excited about this project and this community is the fusion of library concerns, technology, service providers, and standards, and the fact that we have core groups that are working in each one of those, and then we have extensive groups working all across the world. It's really exciting to see something like linked data take root and spread, because the only way it can spread is through forums such as this and community organizations. There's no single organization that's ever going to do it. So, and this community is one of the key agents for making sure it takes root. And next on my screen is Jason, so I'll turn it over to him.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason Kovari, Director of Cataloging Metadata Services at Cornell. I've been involved in the LD4 community for a while now, and before the community existed, the grant series that you'll hear some more about later as well. And the thing that really excites me about this community is the energy. There are amazing colleagues who put so much passion and so much time into the work that they do within the affinity groups or other spaces, and then they often bring it to this spectacular conference that we have this week. So it's really the energy and the individuals within our community. Shireen, you are next on my list.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shireen Naid. I am a library manager at the library sector at Biblioteca Alexandrina in Egypt. I have joined the LD4 community last year as a member of the steering group. The most exciting about being a part of the community is that it's an open forum for sharing ideas and experiences about linked data and technology in the library sector. Thank you. Next will be Dave, I think.
Hi, Dave Eichman. Still somewhat associated with the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Iowa. I am desperately attempting to retire and no one lets me. So it's, from my perspective, this is one of those situations where a technology undergoes a massive sea change. I mean, we've been doing MARC for decades, half a century, and it's time for a change. And this community has been the driver for that. And that's just really interesting to be a part of. Simeon?
Hi, thanks, Dave. And hello, everyone. My name is Simeon Warner, and I'm Associate University Librarian at Cornell University. And I think while I'm excited by all the other things people have mentioned, maybe the thing I'd like to pick on is the idea that work we're doing in this community is starting to meaningfully connect library metadata with external data sources out in the world, which I think stands to benefit in both directions. And we're also already demonstrating through experiments how we can use external data to improve library discovery. And I think that is exciting.
And I'll finish up by just reintroducing myself with my actual role. So I'm Elizabeth Russi-Roque. I am an archivist, the Discovery and Metadata Archivist at Emory University. And I might add to the conversation about what I find most exciting about this community is similar to what Claire said, but just how organic this is. I've really appreciated working equally with administrators and working with people who are in the trenches creating metadata. We're a community that invites everyone into it. It's not just a conversation to be had among university librarians, but this is a conversation that happens at all levels of the organization. And I've appreciated the care of many of the people that I see on this call, but of people who are also attending to both teach and learn this new technology, which has a steep learning curve, and everybody has had so much patience in inviting others into this space. So with that, Claire, can you grab the next slide? Thank you. Okay, let me find where I am. So at last year's LD4 conference, we conducted a survey. That was one of the early things that we did as one of the conference activities. And we'd actually like to repeat that this year. We're interested in hearing what you've been up to, what the community's been up to over the past year with linked data and LD4. There is a link that is here that if somebody on the panel would pop into the chat for me, I'd appreciate it. And you can fill that out at your leisure throughout this session. We'll take a look at results at the end. But just to inspire your thoughts, I'd like to share a couple of things that we learned in 2021 to kind of kick this off. At last year's conference, about 30% of our attendees were brand new to the community. This is the first time they had been to an LD4 event. About 65% of our attendees considered themselves knowledgeable but learning about linked data. It continues to be an interesting thing to see in surveys how many people consider themselves expert And we actually asked the question, how many people consider you to be an expert as opposed to how you feel about yourself? Most of us categorize ourselves as still learning. Most of our colleagues think that we know everything about linked data. So I've always found that an interesting statistic. Attendees use words like learning, validation, thought-provoking, motivating. The word cloud on your screen is some of the words that we gathered from people in 2021 to describe experiences at the conference. And I hope that many of those will be reproduced this year. We also asked attendees to share some of the things they were going to do after attending the conference. They said things like read Data Feminism. That was a keynote last year that we had. Look at the LD4 conference posters, read linked data for the perplexed librarian, play with Sinopia, creating profiles, exploring BibFrame. This is one of my faves. Talk to my boss about making time to learn Sparkle, learning more about Wikidata, and a lot more. We had a lot of people who really tried to use last year as a learning experience. And so we want to ask you this year, we're interested, where are you from? Are you new to the community? Is this your first LD4 conference? Have you participated in any LD4 activities this year? If you have, what are you most proud of? What did you accomplish this year, either within the LD4 community or linked data in general? And if you haven't, if you are brand new to this space, welcome. What are you hoping to learn this year? So thanks to whomever put the poll in the chat. Again, please take some time to fill it out during the panel today, and we'll share results at the end of the session. Okay, can we advance the next slide, Claire? Okay, so now what I'd like to do is turn over the presentation to Tom and Simeon and Jason and Dave, who mentioned that they are some of the original people from the original grant for the founding members of LD4 community. They're going to share a little bit about how the LD4 community began, how we want to grow, and what steps we've taken over the past year to support LD4 above and beyond the Mellon grants that originated with LD4. So I'll turn it over to y'all.
Hi, I'm Simeon, and I think I get to kick off with that first bullet, which is the history of LD4. The term LD4, kind of an odd term on its own, but let's go with it, started off with an ongoing series of Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funded projects. The first project was called LD4L, Linked Data for Libraries, and ran from 2014 through 2016. The initial partners were Cornell, Harvard, and Stanford. And the focus areas of that first grant were data modeling, ontology creation, data conversion, and data creation in these new ontologies. There were then two parallel follow-on grants, the LD4L Labs and the LD4P projects, where the P stood for production, as in production of metadata. LD4L Labs added Dave Eichman from Iowa to the grant and continued with data modeling and ontology work, but also added initial efforts toward linked data authority lookup services and an editor based on Vitrolib at the time. The LD4P grant took a broader look at the ecosystem to include experiments with end-to-end workflows and engaging the library community to ensure a sustainable and extensible environment. This meant a significantly bigger project team, including as partners Columbia, the Library of Congress, and Princeton, plus an even larger community cohort. It was these two projects at the same time, which was really the genesis of the term LD4, which you can see takes off the L and the P from the two acronyms. And in 2017, we had a combined set of community meetings at Stanford. And in 2018, there was the first LD4 workshop at Stanford. The next grant in the series was LD4P2, nicknamed Pathway to Implementation. This had continued focus on the linked data editor, now Sinopia, and associated lookup services. It also focused on demonstrating benefits in discovery, where we started experiments to leverage external data sources such as Wikidata and Discogs and build them together with our library data to show improved discovery. This grant cycle also included explicit work to develop the community and the creation of affinity groups. In 2019, we held the first LD4 conference at Harvard, made possible with Mellon grant funds. The second LD4 conference was held in 2020, which had planned to be in person, but was unfortunately moved online because of the COVID pandemic. However, we might say that was unfortunate that we had to change plans, but there was a wonderfully broad participation because of the accessibility of the online format. We're now in the 5th project funded by Mellon, LD4P3, Closing the Loop, which started in 2020. This grant works has additional effort to expand the editor environment and authority support, to continue work on discovery and engagement with the program for cooperative cataloging. But it also has a very explicit line to set up the LD4 community as a self-sustaining organization. Now I'll hand over to Jason.
Hello again. So within the series of grants that Simeon outlined, there were 2 primary tracks devoted to community. One being a gathering, which Simeon had started talking about as well, and the other being a creation of affinity groups. The gatherings, as mentioned, started in 2017 as invitation-only workshops focused on grant objectives. And then in 2019, as referenced at Harvard, this shifted into an open conference with a program steering committee, sort of guiding the programming, calls for proposals from the open community, and again, the in-person meeting. And we've had an annual conference ever since, with this week being the latest iteration. Meanwhile, the affinity groups took shape. These interest groups or working groups are focused on a diverse set of topics, including discovery, ethics and linked data, rare materials, Sinopia users, non-Latin scripts, and so much more. These groups are self-directed, and the community members participating in those groups direct their future. Each have chairs and objectives. Each are open to participation by anyone across the community. Just join their meetings and participate. Now, realizing that these 2 tracks needed both long-term support beyond the grants and also a cohesive community umbrella under which to advance, the grant participants spun the LD4 community out from under its purview. And this includes the conferences. In fact, 2021 and 2022 were organized independently of the grants, as well as, of course, the affinity groups being spun out from the grants sort of purview as well. A community charter was written, including mission and vision, principles, as well as planned activities and outcomes of the community. And all of this can be found on ld4.io. And then further, finally, a steering group for the LD4 community formed. This group had an open call for interests, and the activities of this group are the point of today's session. So with this, I will turn it over to Tom Kramer.
Thanks, Jason. One of the interesting things about a community with no home is it's hard to do certain things, and especially to do banking. So whenever a conference is run from year to year, it actually requires a fairly significant logistical investment and sometimes a financial investment to do things like put down hotel deposits, to bring in sponsorship monies from sponsors, and to pay forward to organizing the next year's conference. Recognizing this, the members of the LD4 Steering Committee put together a tender or a request for proposals and surveyed the landscape of potential nonprofit organizations that could serve as a fiscal sponsor. And I'm happy to announce that we ended up coming to an agreement with CLEAR, the Council on Library and Information Resources, which is a US nonprofit, as the fiscal sponsor for our community. So as of May and going through next year to be renewed annually, CLEAR is our fiscal sponsor, and we'll be able to bank money and also engage in other activities where having a nonprofit and legal home becomes critical. And so things like signing agreements. I will say that Simeon and Jason have talked a little bit about the conference and the history of the conference. We are very happy to entertain proposals and ideas about future hosts. It is possible. I think we are committed to continuing with virtual conference organization, and that takes work. We are also would entertain the idea if anyone would like to organize a physical conference for next year. And you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months and quarters. And finally, I will turn it over to Dave, who will talk about our work with the chairs of the affinity groups.
Thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, I am attempting to exit stage right here in terms of a retirement plan that's been confounded for the last 2 years from COVID. As you can see from the population of the panel, we're well into a transition from the grant leadership sort of running things to having a far more representative leadership drawn from the community. And with that, and this is sort of my public radio speech, it's time for you to step up, because I'm rotating off. We're down a slot right now because of Phil's retirement. And so we are actively recruiting at this point for nominees for membership on the steering group. This is something where we need to have the steering group be representative of all the voices and diversity in this domain, whether it's cultural, sociological, or even technological. And so from that perspective, it's an excellent opportunity to put a nice bullet on your CV and also to just help make a difference, as we've been talking about here. This is one of those situations in your career that only come along once in a lifetime. And I would just strongly encourage folks to think about participation. I'm looking specifically at the Affinity Group co-chairs, because one thing that's very helpful in all of this is to sort of ease yourself into the environment, start getting involved in affinity groups, step up to leadership positions in the affinity groups, and think about stepping up to being part of the steering group. One of the things that the steering group was very interested in, and we're going to see a bit of that here in a moment, is to begin to attempt to establish a more distributed organizational structure. The affinity groups are intended to provide more grassroots leadership, and then the steering group interacts with the affinity group co-chairs to do overall coordination and strategic planning. And with that, I believe we've got, I can't remember who, on deck for talking about the affinity groups.
Sure, Dave, that's me. So I'm excited to kind of give some information about that organic growth that we've been talking about is very much part of how Dave's framing the opportunities for getting involved in different ways. And one of the great things about this community, and a big driver of that organic growth, is that we aren't making assumptions as a steering group about what's needed to grow a strong and healthy community. We've all had experiences with other groups, with other hierarchical organizations, with other entities that could inform the way that we do things. But we decided to take this year and really spend some time and effort holding up a mirror to the affinity groups that are really, again, doing this work that have already successfully spun off from the grant projects that Jason described, and that can help us by saying what they need in order to move forward and to grow the community. So we held a slightly different kind of meeting. We hadn't done one of these before, but it was essentially a convening of the co-chairs from affinity groups. And we decided to send us a brief survey ahead of time to just get the co-chairs in a reflective mindset, to think about, how do you ask someone about what would be helpful when the thing that would have been helpful never existed before, right? So the steering group is really trying to imagine how we can be helpful without making any assumptions, as I said. So the survey had questions that said, kind of putting on that retrospective and reflective posture to think about projects or initiatives, areas of focus for the affinity group in this past year, and consider some questions in light of those initiatives. So just a reminder, so many of you have already been involved in these, but some of those key outcomes and takeaways from initiatives of the affinity groups were environmental scans of different discovery systems, raising awareness around discovery, raising awareness around functionality of Sinopia in that affinity group, the usage and implementations, getting some hands-on demos within our community for how these technologies have been implemented. creating best practices, a very common outcome, but specifically in the non-Latin scripts group. Also with the rare materials group, doing surveys, looking for opportunities for transliteration. Where is that happening? How is it happening? And then surfacing interests among the community. So interoperability, linked data integrations, and new prototypes, being a sounding board for innovation that's happening in the community. Where can we demonstrate that, but to ourselves first, to get that feedback and move forward? And that's also been seen through kind of different opportunities for mentorship and connection, lots of peer networking happening, lots of meetings being conducted differently. So those were some of the things that our affinity group co-chairs kind of had in mind as they were coming into this meeting. So then we asked them to think about kind of what aspects of the community, not of linked data as a subject area, of this community help to make your affinity groups successful in those initiatives that I just described that they were thinking about. What was the community's role in all of that? And those kind of fell, the responses we got from the co-chairs kind of fell under 4 key areas. So one is just this idea, Shireen spoke about it, of openness, right? An open communication channel, not having any membership fees, having this be a free organization, to have an international and open character that's really representative of our global reach. Another was this momentum for learning and doing. So the fact that the conference and as Jason referred to it, the gathering, these gatherings are at the heart of what we are. So this idea that we record meetings, that we make notes openly available, that really reinforces that we have a momentum for learning, for demonstrating and reflecting. That led into a lot of responses about connections and collaborations, as I said before, kind of recognizing that the affinity groups are the first line of kind of the communication that needs to happen, the discussion, the thinking, and then developing those connections across affinity groups, but also to our systems, for different systems with the different ILSs, with our different discovery layers, really connecting this through the work that we do and how we've discussed and thought about it. So then we thought about also, what barriers have you faced? This isn't all rosy glasses. We know that it's not easy to do this work without a structure or a scaffolding in place. We're asking a lot of our affinity groups to kind of choose their own adventure. So some of those barriers, had to do with financial resources, had to do with a lack of institutional support from those above us who may not understand the value of participation. Some very kind of concrete logistical hurdles in terms of those open meetings and those recordings and sharing that we have, kind of making sure that that's robust and that will sustain. And then we asked the affinity group co-chairs to think about the ways that they overcame those barriers, because we knew that for each affinity group, the barriers that they were facing were likely not related to a particular area of focus for that affinity group. But when we're seeing that these barriers are kind of more foundational and structural, what did they do to get around them? Because that might help inform other affinity groups. And so you'll see, again, those kind of bucketed into these 3 categories. One is that this is a great space for experimenting with meeting formats. So we saw a lot of crossover meetings between affinity groups. We saw the establishment of working hours, where you're not just coming and listening, you're coming to do. We saw groups that had kind of open planning meetings where they would scout out the roles and responsibilities for their affinity group in front of all the members, not as the co-chairs kind of deciding on their own. And then that led to some neat new templates for communication, kind of using surveys, as I mentioned before. How do we gather input? So those templates are now kind of reusable, and we can learn from one another in terms of different affinity groups modeling after one another. And all of this is really made possible by kind of a commitment to orienting. And that gets back to that learning and doing, right? This LD4 community, something that makes us unique is that, as Elizabeth was talking about, there can be quite a steep learning curve for a lot of the technologies that we've talked about. And so that learning mindset helps us when we're thinking about how do you run a community? How do you hold meetings? Those aren't necessarily skills that everyone has had in previous roles, but this is the opportunity to become oriented to a way of working. So those were some of the kind of approaches that people found. So all of that was kind of in that pre-meeting survey. We got a lot of information. And then we reflected that in the meeting itself by setting up that sharing and learning posture. We set up breakout rooms, and we intentionally put the affinity group co-chairs in an orientation where they would be with co-chairs from other affinity groups to, again, share a diversity of perspective and experiences within LD4. And then within each breakout room, we established those clear expectations, a note taker, the person who is going to report out, and we had templates set up for each room to take the notes. These are all things we've learned from the affinity groups as valuable, and here we are kind of showing it back. And those conversations started on, again, what was successful, 2 or 3 accomplishments or initiatives. So we have one affinity group co-chair hearing about the accomplishments of another affinity group, which we thought was really great. Those could be a personal accomplishment or an accomplishment on behalf of your group. Then they looked at what's on deck. What are some initiatives that they can imagine within their affinity group in the next year? And that helps to kind of, again, organically, I'm using that word a lot, but without too much pressure, have our plans for future years inform one another, that we're reducing the silos that could build up around an affinity group because they're kind of heads down in a particular subject area. We're seeing more awareness and shared purpose. And then lastly, we asked people to think about those other communities that I mentioned earlier, things that you've been a part of, and what were successful things that a steering group like ours had done in other communities or leadership group could provide that might be helpful. And all of that conversation was captured in the notes and reported back. And what we realized is you all are the key to understanding and advancing our linked data goals, but we are here to advance our community goals in establishing this community together. So I hope that gives you a window into what we think the steering group's mission is, how we can be uniquely helpful at advancing both the affinity group work and the broader community identity, and that the structural components that we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of financial communication, all of those things that are going to lay a path forward to let this work continue to grow. So I will turn it back over. I think Shireen and Elizabeth are going to lead us in some discussion and Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. So just a reminder to go ahead and put any questions or comments that you have in the Q&A or in the chat. I can look at either one of them. I do want to take a quick look back at the survey results that we've gotten thus far. Give me just a sec to share my screen and we will go take a quick look. Yeah, I'm going to stop your screen sharing for a sec. Okay. So we've got a decent geographic diversity with us today. We've got a couple non-US participants, which I'm always heartened to see, and decent amount on the West Coast and East Coast as well. So how many conferences have you attended? We've got quite a few who it's their very first one. Welcome to you. So glad to see you. And 26% of you obviously live in the LD4 community and have been to every single one of these. That's got me beat. Let's see. Did you participate in an initiative this year? Almost half of you have participated either in an affinity group, a writing project, or something else. I'll just mention again that the types of activities that people are involved in LD4 range from going to affinity group meetings, but there's also been some really great projects that I've heard of from affinity groups this year. I know that the ethics group has been working on actually drafting an edited volume about linked data. So there are multiple ways to participate in this community that aren't just go to a meeting and attend some things. So I'm always happy to see people involved. And I will also reiterate what Tom said in the chat. Do you have a great idea for a new affinity group or something that you want to explore that we don't have yet? There is a form there that we would encourage you to go ahead and fill out. Or if you want information about how to get started, just contact us and we would love to help you work on that thing. Let's look. What am I most proud of? And I don't know that I can get this to scroll because I think I have it wrong. So what are you most proud of? The supportive community around Wikidata. Yeah, Wikidata is an incredibly supportive community in here. I'm learning about Wikidata and Sinopia through MLA Linked Data Group, which is an ongoing working group. Yeah, there's a lot of parallel groups and other communities that I'd be particularly interested in connecting us to. Progressing work on discovery. The discovery group I know has been doing a really great job of doing surveys and really digging deep to see who is actually building these systems. Exchanging Wikidata knowledge, keeping the conversation going past LD4P, one of the major groups of this, of the LD4 community. Contributions to Sinopia, a new writing project about UX and linked data, connections to colleagues from the LD4 community, broad participation. Yeah, many of the people I've gotten the pleasure to work with have come from here as well. Okay, let me stop sharing really quick and go back. Okay, Shireen, you want to handle some of the questions that are in the chat?
Yes, I have answered it.
Oh, I just unshared you. Go ahead. You may have to share it again. Sorry about that.
Someone asked about, Theo asked about Sinopia, what is the future of Sinopia? Is there a user group considered and is an affinity group? Yes, we have a Sinopia user group. It's available at our website. And I believe that there are many sessions in the conference dealing and talking about Sinopia. So please register in these presentations and you will know all about the future of Sinopia.
Shireen, can I jump in on this?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, because I think that the first part of the question is really interesting. Is there anything you can say about the future of Sinopia? And so my team at Stanford is responsible for the development of Stanford and the operational support. And I can say that we are committed to the future of Sinopia. So we are going to be using it. We are already using it in limited capacity within Stanford, and we intend that to broaden both at Stanford for general use and hopefully with other institutions as they also come on. As you all may know, Michelle Futornik, who has been the project manager and the Sinopia product owner for many years, is transitioning her roles. So she officially stepped down like 11 days ago. And we are currently we're in a interstitial phase where we are looking for new leadership for the product. If there are people on this call or in the LD4 community who are interested and passionate about that, if they have ideas about features that they'd like to add or would like to help in terms of training or documentation or support, please let us know. And because I think the next phase of Sinopia, we originally did it as a demonstrator because we wanted to get a high quality linked data cataloging tool. Then we found out and were reminded continuously that there aren't really any other options or any other ready-made options out there. So it seems like Sinopia has become more and more important as we've gone on. So that's why we're committed to it. We are committed to linked data at Stanford, and therefore we have to be committed to Sinopia. So what Sinopia looks like over the next year and a half or 4 years will largely be influenced by the interest from groups like this and from the LD4 community at large. We do not want to, and I think probably would not support a linked data cataloging tool that would only be used internally. We really want to see broad community uptake. And I think that may have answered at least the spirit of the questions. And I believe right now, because Michelle has stepped down, we might be absent a chair for that group. And if anyone wants to correct me, please do. But if you are interested in chairing that group, we would also welcome that.
Yes, absolutely. We are looking for someone to step up and be chair of that group. So if that is something that you are good at facilitating meetings, it does not mean that you are an expert in Sinopia or linked data at all, but we are looking for a facilitator. So please contact us if you're interested in that. I'll also note that in the chat, somebody was asking about a workshop on Sinopia, and thank you, Patricia, for chiming in and saying that there is indeed a workshop as part of the conference this week on Sinopia on Friday from 10 to 11:30, led by Crystal Clemens from the University of Washington. And the link to that is in the chat. So we have another, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I see, and they might be next to Elizabeth. So sorry if I'm jumping turns. I see two related questions about integrations of Sinopia.
Yeah.
And I will say on the first one, the whole theme of this current grant that we're working in is called Closing the Loop. And so we have been really keenly interested in making sure that the linked data that we produce in Sinopia as a cataloging tool integrates with other ILSs, because in our analysis, most people are going to continue to use MARC, maybe not another 50 years. Thank you, Dave. Hopefully less, but they will also be using linked data and MARC together. And so having them, having the two systems be able to talk to each other is really important. You may have seen Sinolio, which was a project to integrate Sinopia with Folio, an open source ILS. And as part of that same project, we have done successful integrations with Symphony, the ILS from Circe Dynex, and also with Alma. So these are all possible now. We've done proof of concepts. And I think as we move into production, we'll see more and more of these types of integrations. And if I don't know on the schedule if there's a Sinolio demonstration, but if there is, you should definitely check it out. It's awesome. We have not done any further work on integrating Sinopia with NF at this point, and that could be the kind of thing that a product owner who can help steer the future of the service could weigh in and help shape.
I also see we have a hand up. Matt, I'm going to let you talk. If you have something to add, feel free to go ahead and chime in. So there's a question in the Q&A. The LD4 site that we mentioned is lacking links to many of the Affinity Groups' actual documentation. When are those going to be added? We are working on that. We're working with the Affinity Groups to get their links added to the website. So if you are a chair of an Affinity Group and have not yet given us that information or passed it to the webmaster for LD4, please do so. We'll be following up to make sure that that is there. All LD4 documentation is open, just as a matter of policy. So we do have an LD4 Google Drive, which is where the majority of the documentation for the Affinity Groups is kept. And feel free to contact me, Laura, if you need help getting into any of those spaces. Another comment, Sinopia is a terrific tool. I'm enjoying getting familiar with it. Michelle's been wonderfully supportive. Yes, Michelle is a treasure and wonderful. Another question, are there any integrations with library systems or discovery layers that don't utilize the convert to mark as a step in the process? Does anybody on our panel want to talk about that?
It seems like an excellent question to bring to the Discovery Affinity Group and have conversations there. I would probably completely mess up the answer if I were to if I were to give one right now.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add that some of the experiments we're currently doing user tests on at Cornell are using a combination of MARC records that exist in our catalog and work records that are being created in Sinopia to enable, better descriptions of works than we would have. So while these are just experiments, these are using the linked data work records rather than converting those to MARC for the experiments.
Yeah, I know the Discovery Group is doing some great research right now into looking at various implementations. I've had the pleasure of talking to them about archives and some of the things that the archival community is doing in that space. Yeah, and Huda, if by converting to MARC, you're referring to converting linked data to MARC, Cornell did last year incorporate Wikidata and Library of Congress lookups directly. Yes, which is awesome.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of nuance to the question, or it could be nuance to the question in terms of like the sort of exactly which data, Laura, you're referring to. If it's if it's like BibFrame bibliographic data, BibFrame, if it's like the bibliographic data we would be creating BibFrame that we would have historically created in MARC, then it's a different track of answer perhaps than for those who are like bringing in external data sources into their local catalog without like sort of co-indexing as MARC. But
there's a question, all you grant people, when does LD4P3 grant cycle officially end?
December of 23, another 18 months.
Okay. Well, I'll give a couple more minutes for any more questions. Thank you for anticipating that. So just to kind of sum this up, get involved. I know many of you are, you're already attending the conference. You are already involved. You're already one of us. And again, welcome to those of you for whom this is your first conference. We hope that this will just be the first of many encounters with the LD4 community. And there are so many ways to get involved. This is one of them, joining the conference. Join our Slack, join our listserv, find out what's going on. It's a good place to see where announcements and some of the conversations are having. Attend an affinity group meeting if you're having problems getting, finding your people, finding your group. I'm sure any of us would be willing to help guide you through that process and help you find a home. There is a rare materials group there. I mean, anything that you're interested in, you can probably find within LD4. Teach somebody a new skill, learn a new skill, go edit something in Wikidata. And then already thinking forward to the conference next year, present at LD4 2023, or as Tom mentioned, volunteer to work with us either to run for a position on LD4 Steering, or even help us with next year's conference if you have good ideas of how a virtual space might work, or even an in-person space. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is here, so ld4steering@googlegroups.com. Please do reach out if we can help in any way. And there is another question from Gloria. I'm curious, are any LD4 groups working on persistence policies for linked data? So is there any work that we know of related to long-term maintenance preservation for links created by Sinopia or other tools? Does anybody have any insight to that on the panel?
Somewhat tangentially, the notion of authority maintenance has been under active work, and particularly the prospect of how do you keep an authority service feeding into Sinopia up to date with respect to a source organization. There's been a group that's been working with both Library of Congress and Getty on activity streams as a way of keeping authority systems as near time up to date as we can manage, given the technology. But that's definitely peripheral to the core of Sinopia itself.
I would also just speak to the larger question beyond any specific tool. I think persistence is likely at the heart of many of the concerns of the affinity groups. So I know from experience with the discovery working group that, you know, that the possibility that data can change and how that's reflected in the catalog or any discovery layer is really top of mind. And then I think there's also a lot that bleeds into the ethics space when you think about persistence, because one of the things that we've talked a lot about is persistence may be one goal, but changeability and actually having things that don't persist and in fact do change may be a different goal for different reasons. And so when and how do you have an ethical framework that helps to inform those decisions? So I think, Gloria, that would be a great point to bring to many of the conversations that are going to be having during the conference, and perhaps some of those crossover type events that we talked about between affinity groups, where there's an issue that's going to be vital to discuss amongst the groups.
Yeah, and Laura mentions in the Q&A, linked data provenance and persistence sounds like a great and very timely affinity group topic. Another question about the grants. Are there any plans to work on LD4? I first read that as LD44. That sounds like too many, but are there plans in the work for another grant?
I think, sorry, I'll jump in, though I'm not there's still 18 months left to this grant. So I think it's just premature for us to speculate. I don't know if Tom, Simeon, Dave, you'll as you mentioned, you're looking to get out, so I won't call you. But I don't know if Tom and Simeon, you would say anything different than that. But I think it's just that we're focusing on the 18 months of the current grant.
That was well said, Jason. I do think as we're looking at the prospect for additional grants, it seems to me that supporting this community is perhaps one of the most important things to do, rather than any specific technical development or standard development. And if people have ideas around what would be helpful or could really help boost LD4 to take it to the next level, this is a great time to let those thoughts be known. This in general, not like right now, but in the next months and quarters.
Okay, so if there are, I'll give a couple seconds for last thoughts. Really appreciate everybody's attention today. Again, please keep your good ideas coming. The only way that LD4 Steering can continue to build the community as you want it to be built is to continue to engage with all of you in this process. This is something that we see ourselves more as facilitating rather than necessarily steering. It's almost we facilitate your work. So please let us know how we can help, how you want to be involved, what gaps you see, what highlights you see. That only helps. And I hope in the coming year we'll have more opportunities to continue to engage individually and collectively with affinity groups and the entire LD4 community. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to check over there again. Thank you, everyone, again, and I hope you all enjoy LD4 2022. Have a great conference, everyone. Thanks.